The relationship between corruption, money laundering, terrorism, and insecurity is very, very real.
FIBA, we are celebrating our 35th anniversary this year. We were founded as a trade association at the end of the 1970s when there was a lot of capital flight out of Latin America. And international banking was something very new, particularly here in South Florida. And FIBA was established to try and understand what this means, how does international banking work, and how do we convey that to our members. And so over the 35 years, we have grown tremendously. We've developed conferences like this, where we began in one room with 150 people, and now we have 1,400 people from 45 countries attending. We established an anti-money laundering certification program in coordination with Florida International University so that compliance people can receive the expertise and the knowledge on how to develop anti-money laundering programs and fight money laundering, and receive a diploma at the same time, which is always something very important to have, not just for personal gain, but also to show to your regulators, to your examiners, we are taking this seriously and we're learning. So it's been very important for FIBA to develop these educational programs, and we also do a lot of advocacy. We spend a lot of time in Washington talking to the regulators, to the policymakers, to law enforcement, trying to get them to understand that while we are partners, and we just heard in our last panel that we've been deputized as law enforcement to help in the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing, that it's still a very complex and complicated system, and that we are trying, we are doing our best, and we just want them to understand that sometimes doing your best may not be enough, and that they need to understand that we just want to work together, we do want to be partners, and I think it shows because here in attendance we have several of the regulatory agencies, the policymakers, not just from the United States, but from the entire region. And I think that shows the importance of what we are doing. Because obviously this fight is not just Latin America or not just the United States, it's global. And we included many years ago the Caribbean, because obviously it's a very important trading partner with the United States and with the region. So with those capital flows, with all of the goods and merchandise that are moving around, and potential sources of money laundering, it was only obvious that we include the Caribbean. So we're very pleased that we get regulators and we get government executives like the governor to come and attend our conferences and to speak. Because without hearing their perspective, without understanding what it is they are doing, it makes it a little more difficult to be partners. So it's important for us to have that exchange. And FIBA as an organization has been throughout the Caribbean giving these anti-money laundering courses and holding several events in all the different countries. We've been to Trinidad, we've been to Jamaica, we've been to Antigua. I mean, we've really covered the Caribbean because we feel it is that important.
In January of this year, Trinidad and Tobago became the first Caribbean country to undergo the new FATF methodology and to also undertake a national risk assessment. And when Wayne called me about a month ago and asked me to once again come to this panel, I think it was a no-brainer as to what it is I wanted to share at the Caribbean Roundtable. Because we have 3 other countries that are about to undergo a similar NRA and mutual evaluation exercise. Jamaica turn will come in June, the Dominican Republic in September, and Bahamas in December. That means I think there are significant lessons from our experience that could be applied to the rest of these countries in the Caribbean. So before I actually get into the details, what I'd like to do is again remind you of the particular context in which Trinidad and Tobago finds itself. And that is by virtue of its location, it is caught between the north and south currents it is ideally located for investment, and that means that financial flows are a key part of the country's system. But it also means that illicit financial flows are a key part by virtue of being a transshipment point caught between the south producing countries that essentially produce cocaine and the north consuming countries, mainly the United States and Europe. And again, that particular corridor, that is the drug corridor that with a number of routes throughout the Caribbean, is what has basically informed our anti-money laundering strategy over the last 20 years. But while money laundering remains a key concern, the face of anti-money laundering and combating the terrorism of financing is beginning to change for Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm sure many of you may have read about the major drug bust that took place in Northern Virginia, where almost $100 million worth of cocaine was found in juice cans. And while that typifies the typical focus that the regulators and the law enforcement agencies have on money laundering, what we've also seen is that terrorism financing and terrorism activities are also something that we need to pay particular concern to, because we've had almost 50 nationals who are now fighting for ISIS in the Middle East. And that, together with the fact that law enforcement agencies are reporting increasing cases of human trafficking, means that the focus has to now gradually shift from money laundering to terrorism financing. And it is really for that reason that our country made a major commitment at the global level when our Prime Minister, the Honorable Kamala Persad-Bissessar, went to the United Nations and co-sponsored at the UN Security Council a resolution on foreign fighters. And that gives you the particular context in which our national risk assessment and our fourth round mutual evaluation exercise took place. And the first thing that we did was to ensure that we created a proper governance structure to manage this process. And at the top of that structure was the creation of an interministerial committee chaired by the Attorney General. And that interministerial committee served as the key focal point to ensure that many of the strategic issues that needed to be dealt with at the national level were effectively handled. And the central bank worked as the technical advisor to that interministerial committee. At the second level of that interministerial committee is what we call the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee. And again, this is consistent with the FATF 2 recommendation. And that committee comprises all the technocrats from the Ministry of the National Security, from the Attorney General's office, from the central bank, and other regulators who come together and are basically providing the technical support that's needed to advance our AML CFT agenda. And at the base of the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee, of course, are the three regulators. On the left side, you see the Financial Intelligence Unit. On the right side is the Securities and Exchange Commission, and of course the central bank, which is considered the prime regulator in our financial system, because we are essentially responsible for almost all of the financial entities and regulating those entities when it comes to AML CFT. So how did the central bank actually go about ensuring that it fulfilled its role and mandate, and without falling in respect of this balancing act. Our approach was fourfold. First, we knew we had to exhibit leadership as the prime regulator in the financial system. Essentially, as governor, I had to set the tone from the top to ensure that my people understood what we considered to be a priority item. And we actually had to divert considerable resources at the level of the central bank to stay on track with respect to the fourth round mutual evaluation, with respect to the NRA. We also knew that we had to upskill and get the right expertise to help us with this process. And one of the things I did as part of strengthening the entire regulation and supervisory process at the central bank was to begin hiring experts from the private sector. And we brought in an AML specialist advisor, and that person actually spent almost all, when we did the time cards, yes, and we do time cards in the central bank. It's a private sector practice, but it's very important for us. And we realized that that person spent 80% of her time last year on the NRA and mutual evaluation exercise. Extremely time consuming. And at the same time, we had to build out a lot more expertise, so we started hiring persons, again, from the private sector into particular positions within the regulatory division. And that meant we had to do a host of on-site examinations. And by the end of last year, the central bank had actually completed on dedicated on-site examination, AML CFT examinations for every single bank and insurance company under its watch. And at the same time, we would have collaborated with the other regulators to ensure that selective AML CFT examination, on-site examinations were done for other financial institutions. While all this was going on, outreach became extremely important. You had to reach out, one, to the industry, and two, to the public. Because you were asking financial institutions to now strengthen and upgrade their own level of compliance, and that compliance was hitting the man in the street. And the man in the street was coming back to say, why is it you are asking me these questions after I've been your client for 30 years and 40 years? You never asked me for my driver's permit. You never asked me for a bill to show where I live. I've been banking with you for 30 years. All my money is in your bank, and you've never once asked a single question, and now you're doing it. And it meant we now had to go back out, one, to meet with the Bankers Association to explain why it is this process was so important, with the Insurance Industry Association to do the same thing, and with the securities dealers. And we then began to look at how we could mount a campaign to explain to the public what were these requirements. Key to what we were doing was the collaboration with regulators. And for the first time in the country's history, we actually signed MOUs with the Financial Intelligence Unit and the Securities Exchange Commission on money laundering. And that collaboration helped because both of these entities do not have the budgetary resources nor the expertise that the central bank has. And it allowed for us to now assist them in their respective areas. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the Unit Trust Corporation, which is the largest mutual fund provider. And we were able to get an AML CFT on-site program inside by working with the SEC. In Trinidad and Tobago, the Financial Intelligence Unit is responsible for the credit unions, and again, through the MOU, we were able to get on-site examinations of the credit union through that level of regulatory collaboration. And given that level of collaboration, we were also able to close one bureau de charge that engages in foreign exchange activities because its AML CFT program and level of compliance was extremely weak. Outside of the collaboration, of course, the national risk assessment was key to what we were doing. And that meant, for the first time, a country had to complete a national risk assessment in 1 year. And let me make this quite clear. There is no country in the world that could complete a national risk assessment in 1 year, much less a small developing country. And yet we had to put considerable resources into getting it done. And the results of that risk assessment at the level of the central bank basically validated our initial views on our own system. And that was basically that when it came to the banking system, our level of risk still remained manageable, and if you wanted to put it into a heat map as we've done, it was at a medium risk level. And that meant we now had considerable room to move to low to medium or low in terms of setting particular targets. So coming out from this exercise, what were the key lessons? One, we need to get the right people at the right table. And I would tell you, spend the money and hire the eagle. Don't go for the squirrel. Get the right resource one time and spend that money. As I said, we hired up, from the private sector, and made sure our AML advisor was there to beat that drum at the level of the central bank. And one of the things we realized is that many of the examiners still had what we call day jobs. They were still responsible for their financial institutions. Yet they were being asked to devote considerable time to a national exercise. So you've got to learn how to do that balancing act by pulling the right resources to the table. Second lesson, we spent so much time in 2014 obsessing over the national risk assessment, trying to get it right, trying to beat this aggressive deadline. And then it hit us in late December. Why? Why should we rush to complete a national risk assessment, to meet a deadline, and end up with a low quality report that will send us possibly in the wrong direction? And therefore we took the decision to get it right the first time. And therefore we are now in the process of completing that national risk assessment, because it makes sense after you spend considerable resources to get it right the first time. And the final lesson, and I think which is, to me, the main lesson that came out from our experience, is really the need for strong collaboration amongst